We've got recording going. So we're good there.
And Teagan, you were gonna record on your end too, right?
Yeah. I haven't set it up yet. I can set it up now. I forgot to record my talk earlier today, so.
There's backups of everything. I'm actively recording it right now, so you don't have to be super concerned. But if you want a recording, you can.
I think once we're here and live, I don't think you can start recording. That's what we had a note saying. If you want to start recording locally, you have to do it before you start the webinar. So
seems to be kind of touch and go, but either way, it is actively.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah. As long as there's a backup, that's all we need.
Yeah, sure we'll
exactly. All right, so we're just seeing people trickle in.
Nobody needs that many more copies of us floating around.
Yeah.
You know, in years
Speak for yourself.
In years prior, we've had trouble recovering recordings and whatnot, so it never hurts to have a backup.
Oh, well, that's good.
So as people are rolling in, as I can see that happening, we are at the 1 o'clock mark. So I will say hello and welcome to our STEM panel. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers for being here. I am your admin, I'm Bree. So if you're having any trouble whatsoever, direct your comments to me and I will do the best I can to make sure that you are hearing our panelists and everything. If you have a question for our panelists, you can raise your hand using the raise hand feature. You can type it in the chat and I will read it out for you when the time comes. Please feel free to ask questions. That's the best part of all of this. And from there, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Teagan, Phillips, Iain Christie, and Raven Forrest Fruscalzo.
What were the chances you were going to get through that?
You started with such confidence.
I practiced and it still didn't work out, but thank you all for being here. And I'm going to start off your conversation by asking you, Raven, why did you decide to start podcasting?
Yeah, so I was at the University of Notre Dame and we were going through a science communication kind of certificate process, and basically the different philosophies behind science communication came up, and for a long time the primary philosophy was what's called the information deficit hypothesis, which is essentially if only the public knew what scientists knew, then they would agree with what scientists had to say. And essentially how kind of conceited and kind of how wrong that is from a back and forth communication with the public. And we kind of discussed how modern science communication processes can be more of a conversation, more developed around why, like what the public wants to know and why scientists do what they do. And so like I have been an avid podcast listener for a long time, and it kind of seemed to me that like podcasting was a really great way of like kind of setting up that conversation where the public can send questions in, and then I can like base my science communication off of what do they want to know, not what do I think they should know. And it was really fun because I got a lot of questions that I never expected to get, like if mosquitoes transmit diseases to plants just like they transmit them to humans. And I never thought that my public would want to know something like that. And that's the whole point, is like, it's not about what I want to tell them. It's about what they want to know and what they feel is practical to their lives. So that's kind of where I started.
Teagan, go ahead.
Sure. So I guess my podcast kind of came about through my various sort of degree changes as I've gone through my post-secondary. So I started in arts after I graduated high school and was studying history, and then decided to switch into physics for various reasons, and had been a podcast listener for a number of years. And my dad suggested that I do a podcast on the history of physics. So that would be a way to kind of combine what I was then studying with something that I did still really, really love, and that was history. And I love studying history. So that was kind of the initial idea when I first made that change. And then because of time, lack of time when doing full-time studies, I didn't actually get around to starting it for a number of years. And by the time I did, which was shortly after I finished my undergraduate degree, it was 2020. And the pandemic gave me lots of time. And so that was when I finally got around to starting my podcast. And while I was doing my undergraduate degree, I made another program change, and I had added a minor in philosophy. So then I decided to combine all of them and do the history and philosophy of physics. And yeah, it's a topic that doesn't really get a lot of coverage, and a lot of people have never heard of it. People have no idea what the philosophy of physics is. History of physics is pretty self-explanatory because it's just history of a discipline, but the philosophy of physics is something that exists in a very, very small sphere, it seems. So I really wanted to kind of, I guess, put more information out there about like what this field is, and just kind of cover a lot of very interesting topics that are related to something that kind of the intersection of everything that I am interested in, pretty much.
Yeah, well, my reasons for doing a podcast are way more self-centered than you guys. I mean, it was interesting when we started talking about this. I originally suggested that we should call this panel "Crossing Disciplines and Crossing Generations," a science nerds podcast. Because, the funny thing is, I think Raven. Don't think you guys should disagree with me. Raven is really the only one of us that's doing hard science, professionally, right? I'm certainly not. Even though my podcast is definitely about technology and I have a hard science background, multiple degrees, I haven't worked as a scientist, well, really since I've left grad school. But we're also of very different generations. Podcasting is very much a thing of my late adult years. And podcasting, has not... Podcasting was always was a thing that I discovered as a means of entertainment, and that's all. That's what it has been to me, is a way of being entertained. Of course, I started like everybody did with Mike Duncan and David Crowther, and I liked them telling me stories, and I guess I was self-centered enough to believe that when I got to a certain point in my career. I always liked telling stories about what I did. I always felt that I had been very lucky to have done some very interesting things in my life. For those of you who don't know my podcast, it's called Terranauts, and it's really a history of the space program, but it's told from the point of view of people who, as I put it, work in space but never leave the planet, which is me. I have spent the better part of 35 years helping human inventions and other human beings get to space, but I've never been there. But that doesn't mean that I haven't. I mean, physically, I've never gotten on a spacecraft and gone there, but that doesn't mean that I don't feel like I've been to space and haven't been part of that endeavor. And I felt like I had a lot of interesting stories because I had been involved in things that because space is a thing that people know about. I've been involved in things that happened that people have heard about, like the Columbia disaster and the recovery from that, like the Mir space station, like building the International Space Station. I've had a window into that, not just as an observer, but as a participant in a very small way. And I thought that that made the things that I had done and seen interesting. Like certainly when I was at parties, people seemed to enjoy the stories. So I always felt like there was an opportunity to tell some stories that would genuinely be of interest to people. But it was really to fulfill my own desire to tell the stories. I do also think that there was a bit of it was the thought that these events, certainly the history of the space program certainly succumbs to the great man or great person theory of history, in that it's normally told from the perspective of certainly the astronauts and maybe the decision makers that ran the space program, as if that's really what it was all about. And I felt, pretty strongly that there were a lot of people, whose names will never be known, who were just as important as the people whose names we do, and just as much participants in making the endeavor successful. And in some ways, and that's really what my talk is about, and I'm sure you'll all come and enjoy that in however many minutes we have left, 40 minutes, is really about what it's like to be a small part of a really big event like that. And I think that is something that's really, we get it from a lot of things, but it's really endemic to the space program. No matter what you do when you're part of the space program, you're a small piece of a much larger picture, but it can sometimes be a really huge picture. And I felt like it was useful to tell that story. And I guess the one thing, and I'm going to lead into asking Raven and Teagan how they feel about this. The other thing that kind of motivated me, honestly, was that, and this has more to do with STEM and STEM education and STEM communication. My kids are both in university now. 5-10 years ago, when they were going through high school, they did the inevitable, civics and careers course that you do here in Ontario, where they were encouraged to think about what they wanted to do with their lives. And almost inevitably, they got a talk from somebody in a flight suit, meaning, an astronaut. Somebody showed up. They went to some talk where some astronaut told them about how wonderful it was to leave the planet and how you really needed to stay in school and get a good education if you wanted to do that. And I would always ask them, not just my kids, but their friends, what they thought of that. And almost invariably, their response was, yeah, that's not going to be me. They were able to, they kind of wrote off the whole experience because that person on the stage was so obviously exceptional to them that they really didn't see themselves. They didn't see that life experience as being relevant to them at all. In effect, those talks were having the opposite of the effect of what they were intended to. By convincing kids that you had to be exceptional, kids were just saying, well, I don't know if I can be. I don't know if I want to invest the time, energy, and commitment to be exceptional. I just want to have a job. Thank you very much. And in effect, it was having the opposite effect by making them feel like you had to be working at some kind of elite level to be, to be following in the path of that person was talking to them about from the stage. And I guess Terranauts is also supposed to be about that. I guess I kind of have two audiences in mind. One are people who look like me, who wish their stories, people knew more about the stories of the interesting things they'd done. And I try to interview people like that. And I guess the other audience is people that are a lot younger than myself that are thinking about a career, to convince them that the kind of things that I have done that I think are very interesting were not because I was exceptional in some way. In a lot of ways, it was because I was lucky, but it was also because I chose to commit myself to learning things and contributing to things that were beyond myself, and that has been a very fulfilling thing to do in my life. And that you don't have to think you're going to have to be exceptional to do that. That's not really the important part. The important part is commit yourself to doing something that you're good at. And let the rest of things take care of themselves. So the question I have for Raven and for Teagan in any particular order is who's your audience, and why are you talking to them?
Okay. I feel like my audience, I have kind of a mix. I mean, really, it's anyone who's vaguely interested in one of the disciplines that that my podcast is related to. So it's kind of like I guess a more general audience. I know there are people who listen who do physics professionally, professors and professional researchers. But don't know a lot about the history or philosophy of the field. So kind of getting that aspect of it, or people who are interested in history, and then this is an area of history that they don't know much about. So learning more about the history of the science. So having kind of both of those are, I guess, the main kind of targets, but also, I mean, probably in at least part of who I'm kind of aiming at or hoping for is like people like me who were interested in something along these lines, but like didn't necessarily know like what this field is or what you can kind of study in it. I don't really talk much about it. Maybe I should actually do a bit more like an episode on what you do as in like the history and philosophy of physics, or talk a bit more about that, or like interview philosophers of physics or historians of physics more. But just even knowing that like this field exists as a thing, because I didn't know like the philosophy of physics was something you could actually study until I was halfway through my undergrad degree. I just didn't know it existed. History of science, yes, I kind of figured that was a thing within the discipline of history, but the philosophy of physics I just genuinely did not know existed until, yeah, I was looking up doing philosophy and then somehow came across it and was like, whoa, this is something you can actually study. And now that's what I'm actually studying for my graduate school. So yeah, knowing that even just that it's there, it's a thing that you can get to, and you can get to it through various different paths. And yeah, you don't have to be I guess super exceptional. If it's something that you're interested in, there's like so much within the field and so many different areas and so many different ways you can kind of take it. Yeah, that's general audience really, but probably also people like me, because it's a podcast that didn't exist that I looked for, I guess, and so now I'm making it because it wasn't there, partly.
Oh gosh, so when I first started my my podcast, it was around the time that we were learning that Zika was transmitted by mosquitoes. There were a lot of reports about it because, well, a lot of misreporting about it, because a lot of the people, the reporters who were talking to people about Zika were talking to MDs, and MDs don't really get any kind of education in parasitology, like especially in the United States. And so there were a lot of things that were just flat out wrong about mosquitoes, about how to protect yourself from mosquitoes. A lot of the information was coming out of Brazil, and the political sphere around vector-borne diseases, so like anything transmitted by an animal to humans, it's very political down there, because things like malaria and yellow fever and whatnot, they're all very prevalent. And I mean, there's a lot more vector-borne diseases, and like how the government deals with them is highly political, which much more than how it got here in the States. But even here, you could see that like Zika got very political very quickly. So there was just a lot of misinformation, or like people saying things with confidence that weren't accurate, like we just didn't know yet. And so that's part of why I started, was like pregnant women, or like people who could get pregnant, or like child care givers, like these are the people that would really be interested in like what is going on with what we know about mosquitoes right now. And that's kind of how I got started. So like my target audience was very much like people who were scared and who wanted to know more information, and they didn't have any way to ask anybody who, like, other than their MDs, and their MDs don't know anything about insects. Like, you know, they have enough in their heads. They don't need to know about that. So it was like all of a sudden medical entomologists were, you know, trying to find platforms where they could actually talk about this. So I thought like starting a podcast would be a really great way of doing that. So a lot of my audience turned out like later as things developed, turned out to be like other types of, I guess, what we would call like intellectuals, like people with high-end degrees who like lawyer types who it's like, oh, this is a fascinating topic that I've never really thought about before. And so it's like they're just like kind of generally curious people, but like I always joke that it's like people with morbid curiosity. They want to know about diseases, they want to know about blood-sucking stuff, but don't necessarily like have the engagement to like want to get a degree in it.
Yes.
So
I mean, the format of your podcast I found really engaging. This idea of, you know, taking a listener question and then actually doing the research on it, like the genuine research on it, not just your opinion, but actually finding the papers and discussing them. You know, it's a lot more engagement than I have with my audience. I don't know about Teagan. Did you find that level of engagement changed your opinion about what you were doing in your podcast as time went on? Do you feel differently about what you're doing now than when you started based on having that kind of feedback in real time?
Yeah, I think people knew more than I thought they would. Like when I was getting questions about like genetically modified mosquitoes and like their release down in Florida and like different things like that, I was kind of surprised that people knew that level of detail. And I guess it's like a lot of what people wanted to know was like the science behind what they were hearing in the news. It's like, oh, there's you know, West Nile in this area, but they weren't knowing like, you know, the details of like why is this area that never had it before now having it. Why are there mosquitoes named after Egypt in Florida? And things like that.
And why when people say the things they do, they're not just making it up. It's not just people's opinion.
Yeah,
right? It's not just because that sounds good. There's genuine method behind the conclusions that people come to.
Right, and I think, I mean, I understand why reporters don't necessarily want to get into the details of like they probably think that people aren't interested in the details as to like how did we figure out that Zika was sexually transmitted, right? Yes. Like what are the details of the actual scientific experiment? But like that's the sort of thing that I think like scientists really need to embrace, is like when we say something, we can't just be like, trust me, I'm a scientist, done. Yes. Right. We need to be able to like explain how we figured out what we figured out. Yes. And I think like a lot of the assumption is that the public's so stupid that they don't care or want to know, or even if we did tell them, you know, that they would
half the time I think it's the opposite too. I think in the science community we think people are a lot better informed. Like we think they understand that there is method behind this stuff, that we don't make it up. that when people come to conclusions, it's not because they like the conclusions. It's because they genuinely have seen evidence that convinces them this is the correct conclusion. And I think sometimes we forget that there are people who don't actually work that way.
Right. But I also think the reason why that came about in the first place is because our communication method for a long time was, this is the way it is, trust me. Like they never bothered to explain how they got the information that they got, or like, so sorry, hopefully you guys can't hear my phone vibrating. So I think like part of the reason why we're in the situation that we're in when it comes to science communication and the lack of trust between scientists and the public is, for one thing, it goes both ways.
Yes.
Is that like the scientists aren't trusting the public to understand how what the experiments were and how we went to the conclusion that we did.
So, I mean, it's kind of interesting though with Teagan, like having studied the history of the philosophy of science, how has that changed over the last, certainly the last few hundred years, the role of science in society and the way it's presented to the public, and whether it's even presented to the public, do you think?
I mean, that's a big question. You could do like an entire course on that. You could do an entire podcast on that.
I mean, there was a time when going to science lectures was the thing people did, right?
Yeah. So I know, I mean, in certain ways, like it's still, depending on where you are, you can still do that. I mean, it's always kind of been a bit dependent on personal circumstances, whether as a member of like the general public, you kind of have access to these things. Like there are lots of public lectures being run by universities. Anyone can come and go to department seminars and stuff like that, and listen to talks on current research. They're open to everyone, even now kind of with COVID. Some of them not so much over the last couple of years, just for reasons. But a lot have been moved online, or have options available, or are being moved back again so that they're public. So it's a matter of kind of, I guess, knowing about these things and then being somewhere that you're able to access them and having the time and to be able to do that. It's a luxury that a lot of people just can't afford. But that is something that's been going on since like, at least in England, since like the Victorian times.
Yeah. Do you think that
of public lectures here?
Do you think that scientists are held in different esteem now than they were, in Victorian times though? Has that changed? Has the way that people view the, people who engage in this kind of activity changed?
I mean, it's, I guess, caveat is that I don't know a ton about how people viewed Victorian scientists. I know a little bit. I've done a little bit of research in the area. But I mean, it's very different. Just the training that scientists go through nowadays is very different. Back then it was, you had a lot of prominent scientists some were self-taught and kind of came to the level that they were at through really their own merit and often fortunate circumstances, having money and leisure time to be able to do lots of experiments and things. So it was exclusive in, I guess, a different way. In the past, it I guess a bit more kind of tied to class, for lack of a better term. Whereas now it is more kind of educational, and a lot more along that basis, which is also kind of similar.
I'm just going to say, Bree has already said it in the chat. I guess everybody else doesn't realize it's a small group that we're talking here. We're really talking amongst ourselves. I know it hasn't sort of been typical today, but I'd be quite happy if people in the audience want to actually join the conversation, at least in audio. I know we have a question in the chat from Bill. Bill, do you want to join the conversation and actually ask your question? It seems like this is a place where you work.
Yeah, can you hear me?
So you can do that.
Yeah. Sound check.
Yeah, we hear you.
Yep.
Okay. Video's not going to go on, so you get my face. Anyway, so I work at a university that's it's an engineering university, and when we're looking at STEM, any of the science and technology, engineering, mathematics, over the last decade at least, there has been an enormous shift over into coding, machine learning. I call it machine learning. I don't like to call it AI because it's AI is a different animal in and of itself. However, the machine learning aspect of STEM and everything that we're learning has become very predominant. And I was just kind of musing as I'm listening to you all. Is that something that you have seen also?
Well, let me just actually throw it out to the other folks that are here. Is there anybody else who actually works in university who because I don't. Teagan is at university. Neither Raven nor I are associated with the university or have been for a while. Is there anybody else in the audience that wants to respond to that at all? Don't be shy.
Give us the raise hand button and I can give you permission.
There you go. Bree is your ticket to fame. I can certainly say, I'll take a shot at it, Bill. I don't work in university. I do spend a lot of my life talking to tech entrepreneurs in the space business. And I know that just about every one of those companies is relying on some amount of machine learning in the innovations that they're trying to bring to market. And that is what they see as being the differentiator between what they're intending to do and what is being done. And of course, that's always what entrepreneurs are trying to do, right? And they very much the ability to leverage the ability of machines, of computers to process massive amounts of data and to see things that human beings cannot as easily as the machines can, and respond to much more sensitive and nuanced differences. I think underlies a lot of the kinds of technology that I see people trying to deploy, not just for commercial purposes, but because they genuinely believe that it's going to help. So I would agree with you that certainly seems to be, the sort of global big data machine learning trend is certainly something that out there in the world, that's what people are looking for, is that people who have command of those kinds of skills. So in some ways, you're not wrong if that's what you're responding to, that's the kind of training you're providing. Bree.
Yeah, thanks.
I'll send you on your way, Bill. I have a question if that was the end of that answer, which is based on some, go ahead.
I want to quickly respond, just really related, specifically about coding. Definitely, absolutely, it's being taught a lot more and taught at younger and younger ages. Even I went through my undergrad fairly recently, and it was required in some of our physics courses, even though a coding course wasn't a prerequisite for the courses, which was frustrating. But it's becoming more and more expected that you know basic coding and can use it at the university level. And because I've done science outreach with high school students and with younger students, I know it's being taught, and even just kind of the basic, mentality of programming and running through algorithms, knowing how those kind of work, those processes work, that's being taught at very, very young ages now. And also, as a little anecdote, this isn't unique to STEM. It is really, really prevalent in STEM. But I took a short course through one of my university programs this year, which was on analyzing medieval logic through using computational methods. So it's coding nowadays is being applied in like very different ways, and it allows us to do work like analyzing and assessing logical structures from medieval manuscripts in a really, really much more efficient way than doing it by hand. So it's something that's not just limited to STEM.
That's really cool. So my question to all of you comes back to something that Raven said earlier about the trust between scientists and the public, and how misinformation has particularly been a prominent factor of that in this period. And now, after the last 2 years, what can science do about that? Because science may not hold the burden of the responsibility of the misinformation or be responsible for the way people are treating scientists. But from that perspective, like, what is your view on that, on how science and scientists can bridge that gap, or how they can present their information in a way that is more available to people to change their minds?
Raven opened that Pandora's box, so I'm going to let her go first.
I know it's a complex question. Clearly, the trust in scientists is something that should be far more secure than it is. But like, do you think podcasting is the way forward? Sharing that information through different channels, or what can we do about that?
Oh gosh. So I think what's happening is like a lot of the way that we've treated things in the past is why we are where we are now. But I think like this concept of I'm an expert, so you should just believe me. It's like, that is an expert thing. It is not a particularly a science problem. A great example is when's the last time you raised your eyebrow when your mechanic told you how much your bill was going to be? Like, essentially the situation is anybody who has a specific level of knowledge needs to be able to explain why they're saying what they're saying, and feel okay with the public asking for that. Mm-hmm. And I think especially when things are moving very quickly, like with the pandemic, a lot of our knowledge was moving very quickly and changing as it went. And I think if people spent more time explaining why we knew what we knew, then people would see the limitations of our testing styles and say, okay, this is how we tested this thing. This is the kind of information that we can get from it. And so when the information changed, people would see, oh, well, this thing had those limitations. We knew that the whole time. And so when we tested it in a different way, with something that filled those gaps, then they would understand. But that like communication back and forth, that why do we know what we know, and like letting the public ask the questions and then answering those, instead of just like constantly feeding people what we think they should know. Like more of a back and forth communication is, I think, a better way of dealing with it.
Mr. Luke Baxter has showed up. Just quickly while Luke's connecting, Raven, I think that that's very. I think that's. I like what you're saying, that, you know, one of the things that I wish we could really do away with in the current conversation, especially as it relates to science, is the term elite. Everybody out there who doesn't have a PhD seems to think that everybody who does considers themselves to be somehow elite. It didn't get a PhD because I wanted to be better than everybody else. I got a PhD because I needed it to do the jobs I wanted to do. I've really never relied on what I did my PhD on. I've relied on the training I got to get one all the time. I've never considered myself better than any other human being because I have 3 letters after my name. And for people to assume that that means that when I say something with certainty, because I believe it, that means that I'm ramming it down their throats and challenging them to, you know, the whole point of a science education is you expect to be challenged. I mean, you know, debates in science circles get acrimonious because people believe things strongly, not because they believe that people don't have a right to disagree with them. I mean, you know, the high level scientists subject themselves to a level of scrutiny on their work that no other professional ever does. No lawyer, no doctor ever submits themselves to the level of scrutiny that somebody who submits a paper to a refereed journal does. Not even close. I mean, the whole sort of central theme of science, at least in the last, Teagan can tell us, however many, 100 years, is that you absolutely open yourself up. You're supposed to publish enough information that other people can replicate what you did and prove they didn't get the same result. That's what you're supposed to do.
Absolutely.
But people think that scientists operate the same way politicians do, that you have to be right all the time, that being right is actually your stock in trade. That's not true. As a scientist, your stock in trade is being accurate, being precise, being thorough. If that leads you to the wrong conclusion, good scientists welcome finding that out.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our time. I know you have to go to your talk, so I will cut you off so that you can do that. Thank you so much for joining us. This was a really great talk. Thank you for our audience members. If you guys want to continue the conversation, there is a break room where you can do that. I'm sure people would be happy to continue chatting with you. Thank you so much.
Yep, I'll be moving over there in case anybody wants
Fantastic.
to chat.
Come to Themistocles in the space program first, though.
All right, bye, everyone.
Bye.